Emily Peterson had always dreamed of owning her own home, a place where she could relax and unwind after years of hard work. When she finally bought her dream house in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she felt like all the sacrifices she had made had been worth it. The highlight of her new property was the pool she had painstakingly planned and installed. It wasn't just a luxury to her, it was a symbol of her independence and a well-earned reward for the years she had spent saving. She envisioned peaceful mornings by the water, sipping coffee, and warm summer evenings hosting her closest friends. The pool was surrounded by a beautiful privacy fence and lush landscaping that she had designed to create her own little oasis. For the first couple of weeks, life in her new home was idyllic. Emily spent her days unpacking, decorating, and getting to know the layout of her property. She greeted neighbors she passed on the street, happy to find the area calm and inviting. But her peace was short-lived. One sunny afternoon, as she was arranging patio furniture by the pool, she heard the sound of someone calling out from her front gate. Turning to see who it was, she spotted a woman she didn't recognize, a tall figure in her 60s, dressed impeccably in pastel colors and wearing an overly wide smile. The woman waved enthusiastically, holding a basket in one hand. Emily walked toward the gate, slightly hesitant but maintaining a polite demeanor. "Hello," the woman said cheerfully. "I'm Karen McKenzie. I live just over there." She gestured toward the house across the street. "I wanted to come by and welcome you to the neighborhood." She extended the basket toward Emily, filled with what looked like homemade cookies and a small card. "That's very kind of you," Emily replied, taking the basket and glancing at the card, which was covered in flowery handwriting. "It's nice to meet you." Karen's eyes wandered past Emily, scanning the yard until they landed on the pool. Her expression brightened even further. "Oh my goodness," Karen exclaimed. "That pool is absolutely gorgeous. My grandkids are visiting for the summer, and they've been so bored. I'm sure they'd love to come by and use it sometime. It would mean the world to them." Emily was taken aback by the boldness of the request. She had just met Karen, and the pool was something deeply personal to her, a space she had invested so much time, money, and effort into creating. She offered a careful but firm response. "I appreciate the compliment, Karen, but the pool is private. It's something I built for myself, and I hope you can understand that." Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered, brushing a hand through her perfectly styled hair. "Oh, of course I understand," she said with a chuckle that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's just that the kids get so restless, you know? And it's always nice to share with your neighbors. But I get it, you want to enjoy it yourself." Emily nodded, hoping the interaction would end there, but Karen lingered at the gate for a moment longer, her gaze lingering on the pool. Finally, she bid Emily goodbye with an almost too friendly wave and walked back to her house. Emily dismissed the encounter as nothing more than an overly enthusiastic neighbor trying to make conversation. She didn't think much of it, at least not until the following morning. When Emily stepped out onto her patio to enjoy her coffee, she noticed something strange near her gate. A plastic bag full of trash had been left just outside the entrance, and the contents looked like they had been deliberately scattered. A half-empty soda can and greasy food wrappers were splayed across the walkway. Frowning, Emily cleaned up the mess, wondering if it had been a coincidence or something more deliberate. Later that day, she saw Karen again, this time standing at the edge of her driveway. Karen didn't say anything, she just watched as Emily unloaded groceries from her car. It felt odd, but Emily tried to shake off the unease. Maybe Karen was just overly friendly or nosy, but surely it wasn't anything malicious. However, things quickly escalated. A few days later, Emily came home from a morning jog to find Karen and two children, presumably her grandchildren, splashing around in the pool. Karen was lounging on a deck chair, as though she owned the place, a wide-brimmed hat shielding her face from the sun. Emily's heart sank as anger flared inside her. She marched up to Karen, barely able to contain her frustration. "Karen, what are you doing here?" Emily demanded, her voice firm but controlled. Karen looked up with a feigned look of surprise, lowering her sunglasses. "Oh, Emily, hi. I didn't think you'd mind. The kids were just so bored, and it's such a hot day. I figured it wouldn't hurt to let them cool off for a bit." Emily felt her patience snap. "I told you this is private property. You can't just come in here without my permission. You need to leave now." Karen stood slowly, her expression hardening. "Well, I hate to say this," she began, her tone icier now, "but my late husband always said this property line wasn't accurate. He told me this part of the yard actually used to belong to us. If anything, I'm the one being generous by not making a bigger deal about you taking what isn't yours." Emily stared at her in disbelief. "That's ridiculous," she said. "I have the deed and the survey, it's all mine, and you know it. Now get off my property." Karen reluctantly gathered her things, grumbling under her breath as she ushered the children out of the yard. Before she left, she turned to Emily and said with a tight smile, "You'll regret being so unfriendly, Emily. Mark my words." As Karen disappeared through the gate, Emily stood by the pool, a sinking feeling settling in her stomach. What had started as an awkward request had now escalated into an outright violation of her space and a veiled threat. Little did she know, this was only the beginning of a conflict that would test her resolve and force her to fight for the home she had worked so hard to build. Over the next few days, Emily found it difficult to relax. The unsettling encounter with Karen lingered in her mind, not only because of the trespassing but also because of the bizarre claim about the property line. Emily knew her boundaries were clearly defined. She had the deed, the survey, and all the necessary documentation to prove it. Yet Karen's parting words, "You'll regret being so unfriendly," replayed in her head like an ominous warning. It was clear Karen didn't intend to leave things alone. Emily began taking small precautions. She double-checked the locks on her gates and made sure her doors were secure at night. She even looked into installing a security system for extra peace of mind. But no amount of preparation could have prepared her for what happened next. One morning, Emily woke up to an unusual noise coming from her backyard. It was a rhythmic clinking sound, faint but persistent. She threw on a robe and walked to the sliding glass door that led to the patio, peering out cautiously. To her shock, Karen was standing on the other side of the pool, hammering a wooden stake into the ground. Emily blinked, thinking she must still be dreaming, but the sight was all too real. Emily slid the door open and stepped out onto the patio. "Karen, what are you doing?" she called, her voice sharp. Karen didn't stop hammering. Without looking up, she replied, "Oh, good morning, Emily. Just putting up a little marker. Nothing to worry about." Emily marched toward her, her heart pounding with anger. "A marker for what? This is my property." Karen straightened, holding the hammer casually at her side as if she were discussing the weather. "Well," she began with a tone that was both patronizing and smug, "after our last little chat, I thought it would be a good idea to mark what I believe is the original property line. My late husband kept very good records, you see. He always said this part of the yard was historically ours. So, I'm just reclaiming it, in a way." Emily felt her hands clench into fists. "Karen, this is absurd. You can't just come onto my property and start staking claims like this is the Wild West. I have the deed, the survey, everything. This land is mine, and you know it. Now take those stakes and get off my property before I call the police." Karen's smile didn't falter, but there was a glint in her eyes that made Emily's stomach twist. "Call them if you like," she said breezily. "I'm just exercising my rights. You know, Emily, sometimes people like you come into neighborhoods like this and think they can just take over, but that's not how things work here." With that, Karen turned and walked back toward her house, leaving the wooden stakes in place like they were some sort of flag planted in victory. Emily stared after her, a storm of emotions swirling inside her: anger, disbelief, and a creeping sense of dread. True to her word, Emily called the police. When the officers arrived, she explained the situation and showed them the deed and the survey. The officers agreed that Karen's actions were inappropriate and warned her to stay off Emily's property. Karen, of course, acted as though the whole thing were a misunderstanding, feigning confusion and insisting she was just trying to clarify things. While the officers sided with Emily, they explained that property disputes of this nature were typically civil matters and advised her to consult a lawyer if the issue persisted. Frustrated but determined, Emily decided to take their advice. She scheduled a meeting with a local attorney, Michael Graves, who specialized in property disputes. At their first meeting, Emily laid out all her documentation, and explained Karen's behavior in detail. Michael listened intently, nodding as she spoke. "You've got a solid case here," he said after reviewing the documents. "Your boundaries are clearly defined, and there's no evidence to support Karen's claim. However, it's not uncommon for disputes like this to escalate before they're resolved. People like Karen often double down when they feel they're losing ground, sometimes literally." Emily sighed, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. "What should I do in the meantime? I don't want her just wandering onto my property whenever she feels like it." Michael leaned back in his chair, considering her question. "First, I'll send her a formal cease and desist letter. That alone might be enough to make her back off. If she continues to trespass or escalate, we'll file for a restraining order. In the meantime, it wouldn't hurt to document everything, every interaction, every incident. The more evidence we have, the stronger your case will be if this goes to court." Feeling reassured, Emily left Michael's office with a renewed sense of purpose. She immediately began keeping a detailed record of Karen's behavior, jotting down dates, times, and descriptions of every strange encounter. She also took photographs of the stakes Karen had planted in her yard before removing them and storing them in her garage as evidence. But Karen wasn't done yet. A few days after the cease and desist letter was delivered, Emily came home to find a group of strangers standing in her backyard. They were gathered near the pool, chatting casually as though they belonged there. Karen was among them, holding a clipboard and gesturing toward different parts of the yard. Emily's jaw dropped. She stormed into the backyard, her voice cutting through the chatter like a whip. "What is going on here?" The group turned to look at her, some with expressions of surprise, others with amusement. Karen stepped forward, her smile as wide and fake as ever. "Oh, Emily, you're just in time. I was showing some neighbors around the property, getting their input on how we could best utilize this space for the community." Emily felt her blood boil. "Karen, I don't know what game you're playing, but this is my property, not some community project. You're trespassing, and so is everyone else here. I'm asking you all to leave right now." Karen's smile didn't waver, but there was a steeliness in her voice as she replied, "Emily, I understand that you're new here, but this neighborhood has a long history of shared spaces. Your pool is such a wonderful addition, it would be a shame not to let the community enjoy it." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This isn't a shared space, Karen. It's my private property. I've been more than patient with you, but this ends now. Leave, or I'll call the police again." The group dispersed reluctantly, some muttering under their breath as they walked away. Karen lingered for a moment, looking Emily directly in the eye. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "People here don't take kindly to outsiders who refuse to be neighborly." Emily didn't respond. She simply watched as Karen walked away, her heart pounding with a mix of anger and fear. That evening, she installed temporary locks on the gates and began researching more permanent security solutions. She also called Michael to inform him of the latest incident. "This is escalating faster than I anticipated," Michael admitted. "We'll need to move forward with the restraining order, and I'd recommend installing cameras if you haven't already." Emily took his advice, but even as she put up the cameras and reinforced her locks, she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen had more tricks up her sleeve. This was no longer just a simple neighborhood dispute, it was becoming a battle for control, and Emily wasn't about to let Karen win. Emily thought that after filing the cease and desist letter and documenting Karen's behavior, things would finally start to calm down. She had taken all the right steps, contacting a lawyer, securing her property, and installing security cameras. But Karen seemed to thrive on conflict, and it quickly became clear that the situation was far from over. One early morning, Emily walked outside to water her plants, only to find that someone had dumped trash across her driveway. There were broken glass bottles, empty takeout containers, and even a flattened cardboard box smeared with what looked like ketchup. It was the second time trash had mysteriously appeared near her property, and this time it was clear the mess was deliberate. Emily sighed, grabbed gloves and a trash bag, and began cleaning up, trying to push the growing frustration to the back of her mind. That evening, while reviewing footage from her security cameras, she caught sight of Karen walking past her house the night before. She stopped at the end of Emily's driveway, looked around to see if anyone was watching, and casually tossed the trash bag onto Emily's property before walking away as if nothing had happened. Emily felt her hands tighten into fists as she watched. She saved the footage and immediately emailed it to her lawyer, Michael. "This is getting out of hand," she wrote in her message. "She's escalating. Can we file the restraining order now?" Michael replied promptly, assuring her that they were preparing the necessary paperwork. "The trash incident strengthens your case," he explained. "It shows a pattern of harassment. But remember, Emily, people like Karen often act out even more when they feel cornered. Be prepared for her to push boundaries further before this is resolved." The next day, Emily decided to take a break from the drama and focus on her garden. As she trimmed some overgrown hedges, she noticed a group of neighbors gathered across the street near Karen's house. Karen stood in the middle of the group, animatedly waving her hands as she spoke. Every so often, someone would glance toward Emily's yard, then nod or murmur in agreement with Karen. Emily couldn't hear what was being said, but her stomach sank as she realized Karen was likely spreading lies about her. Later, as she walked to her mailbox, one of the neighbors who had been in the group, a woman named Diane, walked past her without even making eye contact. Diane had always been friendly before, but now she seemed to be avoiding Emily altogether. The next incident was harder to ignore. Emily came home from running errands one afternoon and immediately noticed something was wrong. Her pool, which she had cleaned just the day before, was filled with leaves, sticks, and what looked like mud. The water was cloudy, and there was an unmistakable stench wafting from it. Someone had thrown debris into the pool, and not just a little bit. It looked like an entire wheelbarrow's worth of yard waste had been dumped in. Furious, Emily checked the security footage again. Sure enough, there was Karen, standing just outside the fence late the previous night. While she didn't actually climb into the yard, she had reached over the fence with a rake and shoveled the debris into the pool. It was a brazen act of sabotage, and Emily knew this couldn't go unaddressed. She called Michael immediately and explained what had happened. "We're filing the restraining order today," he said firmly. "I'll submit the footage along with the paperwork. In the meantime, you should contact the police and file a report. This is criminal behavior now, not just a civil matter." When the police arrived to take her statement, Emily showed them the security footage. The officers seemed sympathetic, but they reminded her that Karen had yet to physically enter the property. "We can't arrest her for throwing debris over the fence," one officer explained, "but we can add this to the record. The restraining order should help once it's processed." Emily thanked them and tried to focus on cleaning up the mess in her pool, but she couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. Her lawyer's warning rang in her ears. Karen would likely escalate before backing down. A few days later, Emily noticed something unusual near her front gate. A small, handwritten sign had been placed there. It read, "This area under review for community use." Beneath it was Karen's name and a phone number. Emily's frustration boiled over as she ripped the sign down and marched across the street to Karen's house. Karen answered the door with her usual fake smile. "Oh, Emily, what a surprise. What brings you by?" Emily held up the sign. "What is this, Karen? Are you trying to tell the entire neighborhood they can just waltz onto my property?" Karen's smile didn't waver. "Well, I've had a few people express interest in the pool," she said innocently. "I just thought it might be nice to explore the idea of opening it up for community use. As a way to bring the neighborhood together." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. "This isn't a public park, Karen. It's my private property. You have no right to suggest otherwise." Karen shrugged. "I don't see why you're being so hostile. The neighborhood was such a nice place before all this tension started." Emily didn't bother responding. She turned and walked away, crumpling the sign in her hand as she went. She had had enough of Karen's games. That evening, Michael called with an update. "The restraining order has been filed, and the court date is set," he said. "We'll need you to testify about everything that's happened: the trash, the pool, the sign, all of it. With the evidence you've collected, I'm confident the judge will grant the order." Emily felt a surge of relief. Maybe now Karen would finally be held accountable for her behavior. But that night, as she lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something worse was coming. Her fears were confirmed the next morning when she woke up to find her backyard gate wide open. One of the pool chairs had been overturned, and a towel one that didn't belong to her was draped over the edge of the pool. Someone had been there, and Emily had a sinking feeling she knew who it was. She checked the security footage again, but this time the cameras had been tampered with. The lenses were smeared with what looked like grease, making the recordings useless. Whoever had done this knew exactly how to avoid being caught on camera. Emily called Michael and the police immediately. "This is serious now," Michael said. "They've crossed a major line. We'll add this to the case for the restraining order, but we may need to consider additional legal action." The police arrived and took another report, but Emily could tell they were growing weary of the situation. One officer pulled her aside and said quietly, "People like Karen push just far enough to make life miserable but not far enough to get into real trouble. It's a tough line to walk, but you're doing the right thing by documenting everything." As the officers left, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had hoped the restraining order would be enough to end this nightmare, but now it seemed like Karen was willing to do whatever it took to make Emily's life unbearable. Emily decided to take even stronger measures. She hired a professional security company to install advanced cameras, motion-activated lights, and a reinforced lock for the gate. She even considered adding a higher fence, though the cost would be significant. As she stood in her backyard that evening surveying the changes she was making to protect herself, Emily couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. Karen might be relentless, but so was she. And Emily was done playing defense. Emily had hoped that the restraining order would be the turning point in her ongoing nightmare with Karen. For a brief moment, after filing the paperwork and upgrading her home's security, things seemed to calm down. Karen no longer loitered near her property, and the stream of petty provocations had stopped, or so it seemed. Emily was cautiously optimistic, but deep down, she suspected it was only a matter of time before Karen found a new way to escalate the conflict. Her suspicion proved correct when she received a notice from the local zoning board, claiming her pool might be in violation of community regulations. The letter, dry and official in tone, stated that there had been complaints about the construction of the pool, and that an investigation was being launched to determine whether the structure adhered to all necessary permits and guidelines. Emily's stomach sank as she read the notice. She had been meticulous during the pool's construction, ensuring every permit was obtained and every regulation followed. This couldn't be a legitimate issue. And yet it was clear who was behind it. Emily immediately contacted her lawyer, Michael. Karen must have filed some kind of false complaint, she said, pacing in frustration. "There's no way the pool is in violation. I triple-checked everything during construction." Michael sighed on the other end of the line. "Unfortunately, anyone can file a complaint, even if it's baseless. It forces the zoning board to investigate. We'll need to gather your permits and documentation again to prove that everything is above board." Emily spent hours digging through her files, scanning every document she had related to the pool's construction. She handed everything over to Michael, who assured her that they had a strong case. But the investigation would take time, and in the meantime, Emily couldn't ignore the growing hostility in the neighborhood. Karen wasn't just targeting Emily through official channels, she was actively turning other neighbors against her. Emily began noticing subtle changes in how people treated her. The friendly waves and small talk she'd enjoyed when she first moved in had disappeared. Now, neighbors avoided eye contact or crossed the street when they saw her coming. One evening, as she walked her dog, she overheard two women whispering on a nearby porch. "She's the one who won't share the pool," one of them said, loud enough for Emily to hear. The other woman nodded solemnly. "Karen says she's ruining the sense of community around here." The isolation was painful, but Emily refused to let it break her. She reminded herself that she wasn't the one in the wrong. Still, the social pressure weighed heavily on her, and she began to feel like an outsider in her own neighborhood. Things came to a head when Emily was invited to a community meeting at the town hall. The notice claimed it was about neighborhood improvements, but when she arrived, it became clear that the real topic of discussion was her. The room was packed, with Karen sitting front and center, a smug smile plastered across her face. As soon as the meeting began, Karen stood up and launched into a speech. "I don't want to name names," Karen began, her voice dripping with feigned civility, "but certain individuals in this neighborhood have been causing tension by refusing to work with the rest of us. We've always prided ourselves on being a close-knit community, and it's heartbreaking to see that spirit being eroded." Several people in the room murmured in agreement, and Emily felt her pulse quicken. Karen continued, "Take, for example, the matter of the pool. It's a wonderful resource that could bring so much joy to everyone, but instead it's been turned into a symbol of selfishness." Emily couldn't stay silent any longer. She stood up, her voice clear and steady despite the anger bubbling inside her. "I'm sorry, but this is completely inappropriate. My pool is private property. I followed every rule and regulation, and I have the documents to prove it. Karen, you've been harassing me for weeks, trespassing and spreading lies about me. Enough is enough." The room fell silent for a moment, and Karen's smile faltered, but only briefly. She recovered quickly, shaking her head as if she were the victim. "I'm just trying to foster a sense of community, Emily," she said. "I'm sorry if you feel attacked, but maybe you should consider how your actions are affecting everyone else." Emily knew she wasn't going to win over the room, but she refused to back down. "What affects this community is people who can't respect boundaries," she said firmly. "I won't tolerate any more of this, and I'll pursue every legal avenue to protect my property and my rights." The meeting ended in tension, and as Emily left, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. But she also noticed something else. A few people approached her quietly, offering words of support. One man, an older neighbor named Tom, shook his head as he spoke to her. "Karen's been stirring up trouble here for years," he said. "Don't let her get to you. Some of us know the truth." Buoyed by this small show of solidarity, Emily resolved to keep fighting. But Karen wasn't done yet. A week later, Emily woke up to find a notice taped to her front gate. It was another official-looking document, this time claiming that her fence was in violation of local height restrictions. Emily stared at the paper in disbelief. She had installed the fence for security after Karen's repeated trespassing, and now it seemed Karen was trying to use it against her. Once again, she called Michael, who sighed when he heard the news. "This is harassment, plain and simple," he said. "We'll file a formal complaint against her, but you'll need to prepare yourself." Karen seems determined to push this as far as she can. Emily's frustration reached a boiling point later that evening when she caught Karen standing at the edge of her driveway, talking to a group of people she didn't recognize. Karen was gesturing toward Emily's house, her voice loud and theatrical. "You see? That's what I'm talking about. It's all about her, never about the neighborhood." Emily had had enough. She walked outside, her head held high. "Karen," she said, her voice calm but firm, "this stops now. I've tried to handle this civilly, but you've crossed every line. I'm done being your target." Karen's expression hardened, but she didn't respond. She simply turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Emily standing there with the group of strangers staring at her. Emily didn't care. She had reached her breaking point, and she wasn't going to let Karen bully her any longer. The next day, Michael called with good news. The zoning board had reviewed her permits and found no violations with her pool. "You're completely in the clear," he said, "but we need to document this pattern of false complaints Karen keeps filing. It'll strengthen our case when we take her to court." Emily felt a surge of relief, but she also knew that Karen wasn't likely to back down. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she had the upper hand. She wasn't going to let Karen dictate her life, and she was ready to face whatever came next. Emily had thought the battle with Karen couldn't possibly escalate further after the community meeting and the false complaints to the zoning board. Yet, within days, Karen found new ways to push boundaries and test Emily's patience. It became clear that Karen wasn't just trying to harass Emily, she wanted to dominate her, to force her into submission. This realization steeled Emily's resolve, even as the tactics against her became more invasive and dangerous. The first sign that Karen was escalating came one morning when Emily woke up to find her backyard gate wide open. It wasn't just ajar, it had been deliberately forced open, the latch bent out of shape as though someone had pried it with a crowbar. One of the poolside chairs had been tipped over, and a strange, oily substance floated on the surface of the water. Emily's stomach churned as she stared at the scene. Someone had been there during the night, intentionally sabotaging her space. She immediately checked the security cameras, only to discover that they had been tampered with again. The lenses were smeared with something sticky, rendering the recordings useless. It was a calculated move, and Emily had no doubt who was behind it. She called Michael as soon as she finished inspecting the damage. "Karen's crossed another line," Emily said, her voice tight with anger. She described the scene in detail, and Michael didn't hesitate in his response. "This is now a clear case of criminal trespass and vandalism," he said. "We need to involve the police again. I know it feels like a broken record, but every report strengthens your legal position. Document everything, photos, timestamps everything you can, and we'll make sure the court hears about it." Emily did as he instructed, snapping photos of the broken gate, the tipped-over chair, and the substance in the pool. When the police arrived, she handed over the images and explained the pattern of harassment she'd been dealing with. The officers took her statement seriously, but they reiterated the same frustrating advice she'd heard before. "Without concrete proof of who did this, it's hard to press charges," one officer said. "The restraining order is a good step, but unless we catch her in the act, it's a difficult case to prosecute." Emily nodded, even though frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior. It seemed that Karen was always one step ahead, careful to avoid leaving any direct evidence of her involvement. That evening, Emily sat on her patio, staring at the pool and trying to shake the gnawing feeling of being watched. The once relaxing oasis she'd worked so hard to create now felt like a battleground. She resolved to install even more security measures: additional cameras, stronger locks, and motion-activated floodlights. If Karen wanted to keep pushing, Emily would be ready. But Karen wasn't done. A few days later, Emily came home to find a letter taped to her front door. It was another official notice, this time from what appeared to be a neighborhood committee. The letter claimed that Emily's pool was a nuisance, and that neighbors had submitted complaints about loud noise and unauthorized gatherings. Emily's hands shook as she read the accusations. She rarely had visitors and had never thrown a loud party. This was another lie, another attempt by Karen to paint her as the problem. Emily called Michael immediately. "She's trying to create a paper trail against me," Emily said, her voice trembling with both anger and fear. Michael sighed on the other end of the line. "This is classic harassment," he said. "She's trying to wear you down, to make you feel isolated and overwhelmed. But don't let her. We'll respond to this formally, refuting every single false claim. And if she keeps escalating, we'll push for damages in court." Despite Michael's reassurance, Emily couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled over her. Karen wasn't just targeting her through complaints and vandalism anymore, she was trying to destroy Emily's reputation. The next escalation came in the form of a bizarre public stunt. One Saturday morning, Emily woke up to the sound of voices in her backyard. She rushed outside to find Karen standing near the fence with a group of neighbors. Karen had a clipboard in hand and was gesturing animatedly toward the pool. "Excuse me." "What are you doing?" Emily shouted, her voice cutting through the chatter. Karen turned, her expression the picture of faux innocence. "Oh, good morning, Emily," she said brightly. "We're just conducting a little survey. You see, several neighbors have expressed concerns about the pool and whether it's being used safely. I thought it would be a good idea to gather input from the community." Emily's blood boiled. "You have no right to bring people onto my property or to spread lies about me. Leave. Now." Karen's smile turned icy, and she held up her clipboard as though it were a shield. "I'm just trying to address the neighborhood's concerns, Emily. Maybe if you were more cooperative, we wouldn't have to go to these lengths." Emily stepped closer, her voice low and firm. "This is my property. You've already been warned by the police. If you don't leave immediately, I'll call them again." The neighbors shuffled uncomfortably, and one by one, they began to back away, muttering excuses about needing to be somewhere else. Karen lingered for a moment, her expression darkening. "You're making things harder for yourself," she said before finally turning and walking away. Emily's hands shook as she locked the gate behind them. She felt a mix of anger, fear, and exhaustion. Karen wasn't just harassing her, she was trying to turn the entire neighborhood against her. Later that evening, Michael called with an update. "I filed a response to the nuisance letter and submitted evidence of Karen's trespassing and vandalism," he said. "But we're going to need to prepare for court. It's clear she's not going to back down, and the only way to stop this is to make her face real consequences." Emily nodded, even though Michael couldn't see her. She felt a renewed sense of determination. Karen might have the support of some neighbors, but Emily wasn't alone. She had her lawyer, the evidence she'd collected, and the truth on her side. But Karen had one final trick up her sleeve. A week later, Emily woke up to find her pool drained. The water was gone, leaving only the damp, stained surface of the pool liner behind. At first, she thought it was a mechanical issue, but as she inspected the area, she noticed scratches on the pool equipment. Someone had deliberately tampered with the pump, draining the water in the dead of night. This was the last straw. Emily immediately called both Michael and the police. Michael assured her that this act of sabotage would be the final nail in Karen's coffin. "We'll file for an emergency injunction," he said. "She's gone too far this time. The court will see this for what it is: targeted, malicious harassment." The police took another report, and this time they seemed more determined to take action. "This is a pattern of criminal behavior," one officer said. "We'll be keeping a closer eye on her." As Emily stood by the empty pool, she felt a strange sense of calm. Karen had done everything she could to intimidate and harass her, but Emily was still standing. The battle wasn't over, but Emily knew she was close to winning. And when she did, Karen would finally face the consequences of her relentless campaign of terror. The day of the court hearing arrived, and Emily felt a mix of nerves and determination as she prepared to face Karen in front of a judge. It had been weeks of escalating harassment, vandalism, and emotional strain, but Emily had done everything right. She had documented every incident, filed every report, and gathered all the evidence with her lawyer, Michael. Now it was time for Karen to answer for her actions. The courtroom was quiet as the hearing began. Karen sat across from Emily, her usual smug demeanor replaced with a carefully rehearsed expression of innocence. She had come dressed in a conservative outfit, likely an attempt to appear credible and reasonable. But Emily wasn't fooled, and neither was Michael. As the judge called the session to order, Michael presented the case, starting with the restraining order request. He methodically laid out each instance of Karen's harassment, supported by photographic evidence, video footage, police reports, and written testimonies. He described the dumped trash, the pool sabotage, the tampered cameras, and even Karen's false complaints to the zoning board. "Your Honor," Michael concluded, "this is not a case of a simple neighborhood dispute. This is targeted harassment designed to intimidate and distress my client. The defendant has repeatedly violated boundaries, both legal and personal. And it is clear that her behavior will continue unless this court intervenes." The judge nodded thoughtfully, reviewing the stack of evidence in front of him. Karen's lawyer stood next, attempting to downplay her actions. "Your Honor," he began, "Ms. Mackenzie is a well-respected member of the community. She simply acted out of concern for the neighborhood's well-being and may have misunderstood certain property boundaries and regulations. There was no malicious intent." Michael immediately countered, pointing out that Karen's concerns conveniently coincided with her repeated trespassing, vandalism, and attempts to rally the neighborhood against Emily. He reminded the court of the drained pool, a deliberate act of sabotage that couldn't possibly be dismissed as a misunderstanding. Finally, it was Karen's turn to speak. She stood, addressing the court with an air of exaggerated humility. "Your Honor," she began, "I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. I care deeply about my neighbors and the sense of community we've built. I never intended to cause harm to Emily, if anything. I was trying to help her understand how her actions were affecting everyone else. I regret if I was misunderstood." Emily clenched her fists under the table, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. Karen's performance might have been convincing to someone who didn't know her, but Emily could see through the facade. The judge, however, seemed unimpressed by Karen's plea. He leaned forward, his expression stern. Miss Mackenzie, the evidence presented today paints a very different picture. Your actions went far beyond any reasonable attempt to address neighborhood concerns. Trespassing, vandalism, and the deliberate draining of your neighbor's pool are not misunderstandings, they are violations of the law. Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done? Karen's face flushed, and for the first time she seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Yes, Your Honor, she muttered, her voice barely audible. The judge continued, issuing a ruling in Emily's favor. He granted the restraining order, forbidding Karen from coming within 100 feet of Emily's property. Additionally, Karen was ordered to pay restitution for the damages she had caused, including the cost of repairing the pool pump and cleaning up the vandalism. The judge also warned Karen that any further violations would result in criminal charges. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing, Emily felt a wave of relief wash over her. It wasn't just about the restraining order or the restitution, it was the validation that she had been waiting for. Karen had been held accountable, and for the first time in weeks, Emily felt like she could breathe again. Outside the courthouse, Karen stormed past Emily without a word, her face twisted in anger. Emily watched her go, feeling no need to say anything. Karen had already lost, and Emily didn't need to rub it in. Michael joined Emily on the courthouse steps, a satisfied smile on his face. "You did it," he said. "This is a big win. She won't be able to pull this nonsense anymore without serious consequences." "Thank you for everything," Emily replied, genuinely grateful. "I don't know how I would have gotten through this without your help." Michael nodded. "You handled this exactly how you should have, calm, collected, and by the book. That's what made the difference." Over the next few weeks, life slowly returned to normal for Emily. The restraining order meant Karen couldn't come near her property, and with the court ruling against her, Karen's influence in the neighborhood began to wane. Some of the neighbors who had sided with Karen started to distance themselves from her, realizing the truth about her manipulative behavior. Emily, meanwhile, focused on rebuilding her sense of peace. She repaired the damage to her property, upgraded her security system even further, and added a locking gate to the entrance of her yard. It was an expense she hadn't planned for, but it gave her a sense of safety and control that was worth every penny. One evening, as Emily relaxed by the pool with a glass of wine, she reflected on everything she had been through. The conflict with Karen had tested her in ways she hadn't expected, forcing her to stand up for herself and fight for her rights. But it had also taught her the importance of boundaries, not just physical ones, but emotional and mental ones as well. Karen had tried to bully her into submission, but Emily had refused to back down. And now, as she looked out over her peaceful backyard, she knew she had won, not just in court, but in reclaiming her life and her home. In the weeks following the court ruling, Emily began to feel the weight of the conflict with Karen finally lifting. The restraining order ensured that Karen could no longer harass her or step foot near her property, and for the first time in months, Emily's home felt like a sanctuary again. She spent her mornings sipping coffee by the pool and her evenings enjoying the quiet tranquility of her backyard, no longer worrying about what new scheme Karen might concoct. Karen, on the other hand, had become a pariah in the neighborhood. The court case and its revelations had spread quickly through the community, and neighbors who had once rallied behind her began to distance themselves. People started to see Karen for who she truly was, a manipulative bully who thrived on stirring up drama and creating conflict. Her once dominant presence at neighborhood gatherings disappeared, and her home, once a hub of activity, now sat dark and quiet most nights. One day, Emily learned from a neighbor that Karen had put her house up for sale. "She's leaving," the neighbor said with a mix of relief and curiosity. "Apparently she can't handle the fallout from everything that happened. No one wants to deal with her anymore." The news brought Emily an unexpected sense of closure. She had never wanted Karen to move. It wasn't about driving her away. But knowing that Karen was choosing to leave felt like a final acknowledgement of her defeat. For Emily, it meant she could truly start fresh, without the constant shadow of conflict looming over her. Despite Karen's absence, the marks of the battle she'd waged lingered. Emily spent time strengthening her connections with the neighbors who had quietly supported her throughout the ordeal. She hosted a small gathering in her backyard, inviting the few people who had reached out to her during the worst of the conflict. It was a simple evening of drinks and laughter, but it felt symbolic of reclaiming of her space and her sense of community. As the night wound down and the last guests left, Emily stood by the pool, looking out at the yard she had worked so hard to protect. The faint sound of crickets filled the air, and the water shimmered softly under the moonlight. For the first time in a long while, she felt a deep, unshakable peace. The conflict with Karen had been a test of her resilience, and while it had been exhausting and frustrating, it had also taught her important lessons. Emily had learned to stand her ground, to fight for what was hers, and to trust in her own strength. The pool, once a source of conflict, now felt like a symbol of everything she had overcome. A few weeks later, Emily noticed a moving truck pulling into Karen's driveway. She watched from her kitchen window as Karen's belongings were packed up and hauled away. Karen didn't come over to say goodbye, and Emily didn't expect her to. Instead, she watched silently as the truck pulled away, taking the last remnants of Karen's presence with it. In the days that followed, new owners moved into Karen's house, a young couple with a toddler and a friendly dog. They introduced themselves to Emily right away, offering a warm smile and a plate of homemade cookies. Emily felt a surge of relief. It was a new beginning, not just for her but for the neighborhood as well. As she sat by the pool that evening, watching the water ripple in the gentle breeze, Emily allowed herself to finally let go of the tension and frustration that had consumed her for so long. Her home was hers again, her peace restored. The battle had been hard fought, but she had won not just in court, but in reclaiming her life and her happiness.